Let's get some historical insight now from Peter Kuznick, professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Peter, President Trump announced today he will allow South Korea and Japan to purchase, quote, a substantially increased amount of highly sophisticated military equipment from the U.S. It seems, if nothing else, rising tensions with DPRK is equaling rising profits for the military-industrial complex.
Well, crises are always good. You know, war is our profession, and the more crises, the more that the military-industrial complex profits. But I don't think that's really what's behind this. This is a much more dangerous situation. We know that the bulletin atomic scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 2.5 minutes to midnight, and this was months ago. Before this crisis, it said that the chances of nuclear war were greater now than any time since 1953. So, and now what we've seen is this ratcheting up of tensions. The situation in Korea is so dangerous that any kind of miscalculation, misstep, could lead to the deaths of millions of people. So this is something we have to take very, very seriously and preempt in any way we can immediately.
Well, speaking today at BRICS, President Putin of Russia spoke to that point, saying in this situation, pressing on military hysteria will not bring anything. This may end up in a global catastrophe and huge amounts of human life lost. What role do Russia and China play in this
Russia and China potentially could play a crucial role. We know that Trump's strategy all along has been to try to get China to put pressure on North Korea. Well, China's got limits to how far it's willing to go. I would like to see China put more pressure. But the United States has been playing this incoherent game, whereby on the one hand we're talking about ending these trade agreements with South Korea. On the other hand, we're threatening China with a trade war. We're imposing more and more sanctions on Russia. You can't have it both ways.
How could China pressure North Korea?
There are still things that China could do. China could cut off the oil supply to North Korea. That would have a very big impact. There are other things that China does that actually aid North Korea's nuclear programs, but China has not been willing to take those steps.
President Trump tweeted last week for his part, quote, South Korea is finding, as I've told them, that their talk of appeasement with North Korea will not work. They only understand one thing. What's preventing talks or dialogue at this point? He's making it sound like there's a real conversation going on, but is there?
No, there hasn't been a conversation going on seriously for many years. You know, between 1994 and 2002, we had an agreement with North Korea, and they pretty much abided by that agreement. And during that time, their plutonium program stagnated, their missile program stagnated. It was really only after 2002 when George W. Bush talks about the axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, that the thing completely falls apart. And we haven't had serious negotiations since.
And at the time, the Republican Congress actually blocked elements from that deal. I believe the U.S. was supposed to provide certain reactors to North Korea. We didn't hold that up our end of it, so it's
and we know the lesson that Kim Jong-un has drawn from what he's seen. When Saddam Hussein gave up his weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. invaded. When Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. supported the invasion there as well. And Gaddafi gets, you know, sodomized and assassinated. Kim Jong-un is, you know, we like in the West to portray him as if he's a bit of a loony. But that's not the way he's portrayed in Asia. They see him as a rational, calculating figure who's got to be understood. He's playing a very dangerous game, and the stakes are very high, not only for his country, but for the rest of the world.
They absolutely are. I mean, just this week, a columnist for the New York Post, Ralph Peters, wrote an opinion piece declaring we need to destroy North Korea before it's too late. The first sentence of this piece reads, better 1 million dead North Koreans than 1,000 dead Americans. Peter, he's not just a media figure. He's also a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. How prevalent is this way of thinking in our military, and how do you read that if you're in Pyongyang?
I don't think it's very prevalent in our military. The military folks I've listened to and spoken to are not taking that approach. They're the ones who really emphasize diplomacy. is people like Donald Trump, who've got no military background and little military understanding, who's full of this kind of bluster. And you've got Nikki Haley saying time has run out. But you don't have Mattis saying that, at least not on his good moments. And Tillerson is certainly not saying that. Everybody knows that there has to be a diplomatic solution. And we even know what a diplomatic solution will look like. Nikki Haley said that this freeze for freeze idea is totally bankrupt and nonsense, and we're not going to pursue it. But ultimately, that's what's going to be the answer. That's what China's pushing. That's what Russia's pushing. The United States and North Korea are still technically in a state of war. The Korean War never ended. And in addition, the United States is carrying out these war games with South Korea that North Korea finds very threatening. And they think that their only defense against, their only deterrent is to have this nuclear arsenal.
Well, it's certainly what prevents this military option, right? If the military high brass knows there's a guaranteed strike back, it limits them. We have about a minute left. I want to ask you, Obama is credited with beginning this so-called Asia pivot. What was the impact of that in terms of the military and our relationship with the region? And Steve Bannon, former advisor to Trump, said in the New York Times this weekend, this is all about China. Is he right about that?
No, I don't think he's right about that. China is our main strategic foe in Asia. But there are 6 of the world's 9 nuclear powers are in Asia right now. This is about something more than that. And the thing about what Bannon's saying in terms of China being the focus, ultimately China is the focus. But in the short run, this is a very crucial crisis in its own terms. And we have to solve this before we can try to improve relations with China. China's Global Times had an article a few years ago and saying if the United States expects and wants China's cooperation in dealing with Korea and other problems, then the United States has got to stop treating China like an enemy, an antagonist. If the United States wants friendly relations with China, it's going to have to meet China halfway. And the U.S. pivot, as you know, was designed to contain China. China's the focus, and the idea was to shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We haven't been able to do that in the way that Obama envisioned, but that's still part of the long-range thinking of the neocons who still have influence in the Trump administration as well.
Right, reflective in John Bolton getting up on Fox News all the time and saying we just need to wipe him out. Peter Kuznick, professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Thanks.